Okay, yeah, great. Okay, so let me couch then this conversation with two statements, and I'm going to read them to you once I find my little statement thing. Okay. Okay, so from the Forbes article recently, they were quoted as saying, while still in early adopter phase, blockchain has huge potential for social impact programs around the world. Okay, so that's on one side of the spectrum. And then on the other side, Gartner Research recently published their view of where the technology is in terms of the evolution of it. And they stated blockchain is just beyond the peak inflated expectation stage and headed for the inevitable trough of disappointment before reaching mainstream. Okay? So with that in mind, what I'll pose to the panelists to start with is your reaction to either of the spectrums. Is this the panache for social impact? Are we gaining critical mass now? Or are we almost in the point of despair where we don't know what to essentially use the technology for? So I'll leave it open to you all to start the conversation.
Should I start?
Ashley, fantastic.
Great. Let me know if my mic's not on. Hi, everyone. Nice to chat with you today. So my reaction to that would be both. I think it has a lot of potential because it does a small number of things very, very well and in unparalleled ways. I would say that those are anything related to censorship resistance or manipulation of data records. So blockchain can do that better than any other type of database. That could include government censorship or other aspects. And it can do very efficient and private or confidential cross-border payments or private payments between citizens. Alex works a lot on that work. It can do those things very well, which could have strong social impact benefits. But it depends, that the use cases you're thinking about take advantage of those aspects, or maybe there's a couple other aspects. And then related to the other question or point, there was a lot of inflated expectations around this. But if we really, which is true, and we're past the hype cycle now, but I think that if we focus on where it really shines, it does have a lot of potential. It's just that where it shines is smaller than the hype cycle led it to be.
Got it. So, and also in many ways, originally people thought, blockchain was all about Bitcoin and only Bitcoin, and I think we've evolved to realize that it's actually the back-end technology. Alex, given your expertise in this space, for the folks that are relatively nascent in the field, how would you explain blockchain as a technology to them?
Yeah, so when Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever they were, created Bitcoin, maybe they're in the room today, we don't know. But he, she, they, whoever it was forced to use a blockchain database to achieve something very important, which is the decentralization of digital money, which humans had never had before. So now we have money that's decentralized, right? And that's really, really powerful. And at the Human Rights Foundation, we help people who live under authoritarian governments. And these folks are behind financial barriers. They face things like hyperinflation, price controls, sanctions, financial kind of controls. So for them, the ability to be able to transact peer-to-peer with someone like me, sitting here, like on my phone right now, I can send Bitcoin to someone in Nigeria or Venezuela or China or Burma, and there's literally nothing that government can really do about that. Nothing. Now, within 10, 20 minutes, that person can receive some value via this blockchain-based financial system, and it goes completely peer-to-peer to that person. Now, the big question has been in our mind, what the heck do they do with it once they get it, right? Like, what can they do with Bitcoin? And I think one of the big myths, at least for the first 5, 6, 7 years of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and blockchain, was that this was going to be some sort of mass merchant powered thing where you could go buy things with Bitcoin. That was kind of that was not the reality. So that's not kind of how it's going to work. But what we are seeing is it replace a very important function in today's world, which is the wire, the ability to just move an arbitrarily small or large amount of money from one place to another on our planet within minutes. Now, what we are seeing today is rapidly increased adoption in certain countries where you can have liquidity. So there are these eBay-type platforms that allow you, once you've received the Bitcoin from someone like me here in Berkeley, to then like put it up for sale, and then someone will come and buy it for you and give you local cash. So this is happening in countries, again, like Nigeria, Venezuela, where the liquidity time, meaning the time when the Bitcoin would hit your phone, right, to when you can have local cash in your hand is 15 minutes, right? So this is a really powerful tool for foreign aid, remittances, humanitarian aid, and personally, I think it's going to completely change the game when we talk about corruption and overhead costs. So much of foreign aid gets wasted. I mean, you look at some of these analysis of U.S. government or Gates Foundation or various large charitable efforts where 60, 70, 80% of the money doesn't make it to the people that we're trying to give it to. So we can just go around that entire system and go peer-to-peer, and that's why I really think that at least like the Bitcoin blockchain is really exciting.
Great, and so that manifestation is the Bitcoin application of it, and specifically for kind of financial services and financial inclusion and accessibility. Steve, in terms of what you're doing, how are you all implementing blockchain technology or thinking about implementing?
Yeah, so first of all, I apologize. I have a little bit of a cold, so it might have issues here. But so I work at an NGO. Part of the way that I kind of got tied into it, because I'm on the global treasury side of a large NGO. So I have multiple different functions. One is to advise and assist other NGOs to build out their treasury function. The other is to basically create a network of global treasurers at universities like the UC system, foundation treasurers like Gates or Ford or Rockefeller, and the NGO sector. So we're looking at kind of cash movements globally, particularly around the global south and where that goes. I kind of got pulled into it mainly because our head of innovation basically said, we need to, our CEO actually was at Davos. He came back and said, we need to be on top of this, to be in front of the curve, so to speak. And how do we develop a competitive edge around this? And because I had a background in the cross-border payment space or the transactional space, all of a sudden I just started researching, trying to figure out what is out there. There's a lot of the peer-to-peer kind of stuff going on, but within the NGO space where we're spending a lot of money, it is through traditional bank channels, through the wire systems that are longer and slower and more costly. So when I was looking at this, I saw all these opportunities. I would say I'm a lot less of the, when I was trying to think of how to typecast myself, I just said I'm like the cynical optimist where there is opportunity. We see what is happening, but it's happening within challenging environments, and the NGO community is still kind of trying to wrap its head around how it participates in this space. That said, there's a zillion peer-to-peer kind of fintechy, blockchainy type opportunities that are hitting the NGO sector that are trying to grow. And the question really is, how do the big stakeholders kind of participate and move this along? Because one of my questions around where is this going to go at the end of the day is, who's going to move it forward, really? We see a lot of interest from a lot of multinationals like the World Bank, all the UN families is extremely involved. But a lot of the NGOs at large, I look at a universe across about 100 different NGOs, mainly the ones above like 100 million and above, and there's a kind of a wait and see model aspect to it. So I guess a roundabout circle to say is there's a lot of interest, there's a growing awareness and education, but the opportunity still exists, and it's just a matter of trying to kind of marry those two together. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Well, for the early adopters, what are they seeing as the risk reward? And I don't know if WEF would be a good opportunity to talk about that, but sorry, I have a cold too.
He gave it to me.
Apparently.
I'm in between now.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll get it tomorrow.
This would be a different kind of blockchain. This is the illness blockchain. Okay. So in terms of the risk of reward, when a organization is deciding whether or not to implement the technology, the early adopters are obviously interested in pursuing it. What are kind of like the criteria to decide to implement it or not? Do you have to have a technology staff that can implement it? What level of research do you do before you actually decide to pursue something like that?
Good question. So this is a good question. I'm sure my colleagues here would have views. I'd say the number one priority is the identification of the need for blockchain to solve a specific problem. And this is quite difficult. I've made mistakes about this as well, even in my work at the forum. We really need to hone in, and whether you're a company or even whether you're a blockchain professional seeking areas where blockchain is helpful, you need to hone in on the problems where it can be helpful. So as I mentioned, the censorship resistance or database immutability feature of blockchain, efficient payments, private payments that don't need the banking system or institutions, or maybe another place it's useful is if you have multiple parties who are using a bunch of paper and processes, like the 3 Ps, and maybe they have hierarchical power, and they don't trust each other, or no one party should be ruling the database. Blockchain would be the technology that could be used to serve as a database where each of these contributors have equal power and no one can overwrite each other's information. So those are 3 places that blockchain is very helpful. So does the company or the government have a problem there with one of these aspects? If so, then maybe blockchain could be helpful. So I'd say that's the first step. And then there's a research process there. I don't think that the company or government needs to have a team in-house because there's a lot of specialists who could help them, whether it's consultants or other organizations, and that they don't need to have a dedicated staff to do this. But they really need to be clear about the problem and if blockchain can help. And blockchain actually implementation is quite cheap, so risk reward in terms of cost can be quite cheap. If you have an enterprise consulting firm or a enterprise service that's implementing the system, it could be expensive. We have blockchain as a service now, BaaS. There are companies who provide this service, Microsoft Azure BaaS, for instance, or Amazon has a BaaS system now, other companies. But you don't need to use these services either. You could just have technologists develop a solution for you, and that's what we're doing with the pilot in Colombia.
Okay, so there's enough infrastructure, service providers that can help people implement blockchain if that's the technology they decide
They can implement it, and they don't need to use an enterprise platform at all. So it's quite interesting. We're doing a pilot in Colombia, which I could talk about. It's a social impact project, and the way that blockchain works is quite different. We're talking about decentralized databases that no one owns. So no one owns the Ethereum blockchain network. You don't have to pay fees to Ethereum to use it. And that was a question that kept coming up with the government there. How much does this cost? Won't we have to pay someone? Don't we have to pay fees to Ethereum? No, you don't. You pay small transaction fees on the network that are less than 50 cents or 25 cents per transaction fee, but that can be it.
How do you determine what's a good developer versus one that's not, especially if you're thinking about local context development?
We created an RFP for the development of this pilot, and I'm not sure the best way to do it, but we thought, we stipulated if there's a team that has at least 3 people that have a couple years of experience in blockchain development, or maybe they've done 2 projects similar in scope to this one with blockchain, then that could be good. There's not a lot of deep experience of developer teams in blockchain because it's very new. So a couple people who have been doing this for a couple of years and they have a track record of successful projects and they understand the protocols well, you could talk to them to figure that out.
It's kind of amazing what an opportunity is, especially for like students. Right now, if we just look at finance, if you want to, change the world in finance, you need to go to Harvard or be a VC or spend 30 years in finance, right, to really get to that level where you can make decisions about monetary policy, international trade policy. So on the Bitcoin blockchain, it's very different. Basically, if you understand how to code with Python, which you can do in 6, 12, whatever months, depending on how smart you are, especially if you're going to Berkeley, you can then go to a boot camp and within several months know enough to actually meaningfully contribute to the Bitcoin source code. There's nothing more democratic than this because it means that no matter where you are, where you live, what languages you have, gender, sexuality, religion, doesn't matter. You can meaningfully contribute to the future of money within less than a year. It's a very transformative thing, and I think for students it's really important that they kind of grasp this, especially if they're doing computer science. It will really give them a really interesting opportunity as we move forward.
So lots of the implementations I've seen are new programs, new services, new ideas, starting from the ground up. Have you seen anything where it's migrating from a current process program where they had a centralized database or otherwise moving all their data from a centralized database to a more blockchain technology?
Yeah, there's one that's a huge one that's about to happen. So you know when you log, when you go on the internet and you log onto a new service, for example, maybe you're logging into like Airbnb or something like that, and it may say, do you want to log in with your Google or Facebook account, right? So these large internet titans are starting to collect enormous amounts of data on us, which is very concerning, right? Obviously, depending on where you live, more concerning maybe in China than here, but very concerning nonetheless. So, and you can read about this online, and there's going to be more information that comes out soon about this, but I'll give you the broad strokes. Microsoft is basically trying to decentralize this process. They're trying to allow you to log into any service that you want on the internet using your own data and without giving up any of your own data to anyone else. And they're going to be using basically a decentralized identity system that's anchored into the Bitcoin blockchain to do this. And this is gonna happen soon. And they own 95% of all corporate identity in the world, right? So they don't even have to convince anybody. They're just gonna switch over, and that's gonna be that, you know? So this is at least what they told me. So I was like, wow, okay. And you know, like people using it won't know that it's on Bitcoin. They won't know that it's on a blockchain. They'll have no idea. You know, I think that's the key part. They'll look down at their app and they'll just go like this and it'll work, right? But the key part is that some big company won't own your stuff. It's kind of exciting, So that's something that's happening right now. So, you know, we're seeing that happen. So certainly there was like a lot of hype, I think, but I think this is clearly, to me at least, a revolutionary innovation.
Clearly we need that on Berkeley's campus too. I mean, Cal Central can only get you so far, so that it would help. We have like 90 systems with 90 sign-ons. So that's super interesting. And I mean, to your point, the consumer or the end user rarely knows what's in the back end, right?
I don't really know how the internet works, but I can talk to you a lot about like what you can do on it, right? I think that's a similar thing. People aren't really going to know exactly how the base blockchain, whether it's Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever, they're not going to really know how it works. They don't have to know, you know? They're going to understand the social impact of it without needing to understand how to code it, right?
I guess the question is, do they really need to know? If you're a user, do you need to know? Is there a risk if you're actually a user and there's things being tracked either publicly or privately that you don't know about? So say you're a beneficiary receiving a payment and your purchases at a local, in a Santee shop in the Philippines, and someone is tracking that you're buying a bottle of alcohol at these different places.
Yeah.
Should that be known to the actual beneficiary that stuff is being tracked?
Look, education's always better. It's always better if you know. Like, it's always better if you know the fact that if you're sending a payment to the Philippines from here, for example, that there's going to be, in today's system, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 intermediaries between you, whether it's your bank, SWIFT, their bank, maybe like a third-party service. Any of these things in the middle can surveil, censor, freeze, etc. It would be good for you to know that, but most people don't know that, right? There's going to be another really large innovation in this space happening soon with Facebook. So Facebook's coming out with its own cryptocurrency. It's going to be called Facebook Coin or something like that. And they're going to pilot in India, okay? So right now, one of the big challenges is that if I have money here today in Berkeley, it's very difficult for me to send $20 like that to someone in India. It's like basically, it's very difficult. So imagine if you could just do it on WhatsApp. Wouldn't that be cool? So that's what they're doing. My concern as a civil libertarian is that it's going to be a surveillance machine. It's not going to be helpful for human rights. It may be helpful for convenience and for commerce, but it won't be very helpful for civil liberties, privacy, and human rights. So these are the big questions we're going to talk about.
Yeah. We don't know. Like, Facebook hasn't confirmed this activity, and if it were happening, we don't know where the data would be stored, right? So even if they were doing it, they might not be storing the data themselves.
Well, that's true, but it's going to vary on a country-by-country basis. So the Indian government will necessarily request that Facebook allow it to see all the data, right? Maybe the American government will say something different. I doubt it. But each government will force these companies to comply, and they will have these like know your customer and anti-money laundering, basically laws and policies. So you know all of these kind of like corporate decentralization projects. You know, there will be a limit to how decentralized they can be because they will need a backdoor at some point, right? Because the government that allows them to operate in that area will require a backdoor, or they will say you can go somewhere else.
Does that apply also, do you think, to the nonprofit area in terms of many of these, the three of you actually are part of nonprofits or NGOs. Can a nonprofit be the one to accelerate it, and are corporates the ones that are going to have a bigger challenge because of either policy or public domain?
What have you seen, Steve?
In terms of influencing local governments around their regulatory, or what?
Well, if there's a hurdle around the corporates where we're unsure about how to trust Facebook's not exactly in the high trust zone right now, right, on data, and so so if they're coming out with blockchain backed technology, but it's still a Facebook product, and I'm sure there's some sort of business model around that for them, a revenue model. The governments are going to want their as you were mentioning, their purview into the data. But NGOs, do we still have that same limitation or challenge? Do the governments have access to that, or can entities themselves be the ones to push forward the technology?
I mean, the way I look at it is a lot of the question around how much is hype versus reality is based on the overhang of whether or not the regulatory and compliance regimes the stances per country, how that will evolve. And so there is a bit of a wait and see from legal's perspectives and different NGOs. They're trying to figure out, well, what does it mean around oversight from local governments? If we're talking about Somalia, or if we're talking about Afghanistan, or various types of governments, there is unclarity. There's lack of clarity around that. I mean, I was talking to a policymaker here in California who's looking into the regulatory compliance policy within the state of California as its repercussions for corporate or nonprofit, and there still is a lot of research being done, and so because that hasn't been kind of, the frameworks and the decisions around that haven't been made yet, there's a lot of questions. So for an NGO or a nonprofit to be able to influence that, sure, we can speak into that policy dialogue as it's being developed, but it's still kind of a bit of a wait and see, and that's challenging.
Sure.
Yeah, and it might be worth taking a step back as well and thinking about digital currency, blockchain-based cryptocurrency, digital currency in different tracks. So the one would be could be one implemented by an enterprise or a government. And in these forms, if you're enabling citizens to make payments, the payment system must comply with the domestic laws, right? The anti-money laundering and counter terrorism, anti-terrorism financing, et cetera, that Alex was alluding to. So, so this must happen if it's a state-sanctioned, if it's a legally allowable payment system, if it's operating on blockchain or not. And that happens today with our own non-blockchain payments. Or you can have a digital currency system that isn't sanctioned specifically by the government, and that would be like a Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency like Ether. And governments will be deciding on a case-by-case basis whether it would be legal for citizens to conduct payments here. Even if they decide that it's not legal, of course, citizens could still do so if they're able to, which is great for mitigating it against state surveillance. But you kind of have these.
Yeah, I think what's going to be really interesting to watch is what governments do. So you can look at the Chinese government, right? A very authoritarian government, very concerned about people uprising, very concerned about people having too much power. Bitcoin is not illegal in China. It's actually quite popular, especially for Communist Party officials to move their money offshore and escape capital controls. This is one of the reasons it's so popular. Basically what they do is when you have a lot of money, if you're a Communist Party official, you basically invest in a hydroelectric dam and you create a lot of Bitcoin and you move it out without Xi Jinping being able to do anything about it. And this is one of the reasons why he hasn't decided to make possession of Bitcoin illegal. Now the other thing is, if he decides to do that, if a dictator or a government decides to make possession of Bitcoin illegal, there's going to be massive brain drain, right? So all these entrepreneurs and amazing, brilliant coders and miners and developers, et cetera, they're going to go somewhere else. So if China makes possession of Bitcoin illegal, that'll be a boon to technology industries in Korea, Taiwan, Japan. So there's going to be this like global competition happen. So if one country makes it too restrictive to innovate in this space, those people will go somewhere else. So it's highly, highly unlikely that all 185 whatever countries in the world are all going to agree on something. Basically impossible. So there will always be, no matter what like the world powers want to do here, whether the EU and America and China decide tomorrow, we're all going to like unite and say Bitcoin should be illegal. All these small island countries and other countries in the developing world are going to be like, great, we'll take all of your developers and your innovators. They can come here, right? So you're going to start to see this where it's not just a decision that they can make about domestic politics. It's gonna actually start to depend on this sort of international competitive commerce thing. It's gonna be really interesting to watch.
So in this case, one of the biggest impediments potentially in the future is the government and the policies that they implement.
Totally.
What are some of the other big potential hurdles or issues that we're seeing now and or that can be in the future?
Well, the Human Rights Foundation just is helping finance a research project in Colombia looking at Venezuelan refugees. And the challenges we're seeing are actually much more like boring, I guess. It's more about usability, education. People don't understand what this is. The Venezuelan government made its own cryptocurrency called the Petro, which is totally centralized and it's a surveillance mechanism. And people in Venezuela got really confused because they're like, oh, well, I heard that the cryptocurrency was actually Petro. And this was like one of the goals of the government was to cause like confusion so that fewer people would use Bitcoin. So right now there's like an education problem. It's very difficult to educate people about like how Bitcoin works and how it functions. It's not easy. It's kind of like chemistry. You have to take like several years of coursework about it to really understand it, right? So that's really hard. And also usability. Like we're talking like it's 1990 for cell phones. Cell phones in 1990 were really large. The usability sucked. It was really expensive. Only like super rich people could have them. And now like anyone has them around the world and you can do a lot more than making a phone call, right? So we're kind of in like 1990 with cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. It's like it's very clunky. It's just very difficult to use it for the average person, right? But I really think that in 5-10 years, that'll be totally different and it'll just be like a swipe.
What about things like the 51% or the Red Queen, if you're familiar with any of those terms in terms
What was
of
the second one you said?
the Red Queen?
I don't know.
Like attacks on these
Yeah.
things?
Red Queen.
Yeah, so to attack the Bitcoin blockchain, you'd have to hijack the entire Hoover Dam and run it for like a full day. And then all you could do really is mess around with like the next incoming transactions. You can't steal anybody else's Bitcoin and you can't edit the historical records.
You could remove historical records, though.
It would be impossible to go back any further than a few blocks. Even if you had the Hoover Dam, like literally focusing on the Bitcoin blockchain, it's very immutable. Now, a lot of other startup projects are less immutable, and they've been attacked. So entrepreneurs have to be really careful about this, right?
What's the way that they've been attacked that you're familiar with?
Like you can basically go online and rent a whole bunch of mining equipment and use it to attack like a proof of work blockchain and double spend and steal people's money.
Yeah.
So people have done this on smaller projects that aren't as robust as Bitcoin.
Because the chain is actually small, so
yeah, the hash rate, the amount of electricity required to basically take over the network and double spend other people's money is something that would only cost you $50,000, $100,000 or something like that in terms of rental costs.
Yeah.
So that's happened like numerous times.
So not to get too into the weeds of the technology, but the longer the ledger, the more the data, the harder it would be to actually have anybody attack it.
It's more about the hash rate. So how many people around the world are competing to mine that particular blockchain? So in Bitcoin, it's very intense. It's a very, very difficult competition. So it's very difficult to commit fraud. But on a new project, it's easy to commit fraud. So,
But even if it's not new, like Ethereum Classic was the most recent major 51% attack, and that's the original Ethereum network. It's been around since like 2014, 2015.
Yeah, that just got attacked, right?
It just got attacked.
Yeah.
It was really cheap. They rented hashing power.
Mm-hmm.
It was cheaper than what, there's an academic named Joseph Bonneau at Stanford who has estimated the costs of attacking networks. There's a website, 51 attack or something, where he estimates the costs of different types of attacks.
It tells you how
hashing
much
power.
per hour you'd have to spend on all these different things.
And that's
to
been
attack
around
them.
for years, and it has a long chain, but it's the hashing power that was quite low, and that's because Ethereum split into a new branch where a lot of the hashing power is dominated. And what we're talking about there is miner participation in an activity. So the more of these miners, we don't have to get into terminology there, the more energy you would need to dominate them, to set your own
Yeah, this is probably getting too much into the weeds. I think what you need to know is that there is at least one network, like the Bitcoin network, that is basically really, really difficult to manipulate, and no one's done it yet. And will they be able to do it in the future? Maybe, we don't know. But at the moment, not even nation states are trying to attack it. And that's because there's economic incentives to using it, right? So government officials in a lot of these countries are using it, right? So again, just watching this interplay is going to be very interesting.
Yeah, fantastic. So let's talk a little bit more about specific examples that you have either implemented and or are seeing being implemented, and if you can talk about the genesis of it and then kind of where it is now. And I'll let any of you, Steve, go ahead.
Sure. So we have a project in Nepal. I was out there a few months ago called Sika. It basically started a UN ops guy, walked into our office. He was a Solidity developer, and he had a strong interest in trying to work with, we have a big presence in Nepal post-earthquake, and then we brought in some guys from the Kathmandu TEDx kind of conference, and they were essentially trying to develop a solution. Basically, some of the challenges around, or what it was essentially a digital asset transfer kind of model. So if we got a grant in from any of our donor agencies into World Vision Nepal, and then they try to turn it into a one-to-one basis token, specifically on the Ethereum blockchain, to be able to do kind of transfers to local beneficiaries. That was tested with a couple hundred people, and it went successfully, and they're trying to further develop it and further scale it. It passed some of our internal info security type tests, but there's still additional tests that are being developed and designed. I think what's interesting is the fact that a lot of the challenges that they had was actually with the Nepali government in ensuring that it's not a cryptocurrency, that it is not you're not buying and selling some sort of cryptocurrency, but it's called Sika. It's a coin that is equivalent but not the same. And it allows people, local beneficiaries, to, on their phone through SMS, receive the donation, so to speak, or that Sika token, to be able to use it to buy goods for their local family, people who were affected by the earthquake or post-earthquake situation. And it's quite an interesting case example of something that was developed within World Vision. There are a couple examples within large NGOs that are doing things like this, but there's also a lot that are partnering with local kind of blockchain tech kind of developers as well.
So for that specific example in World Vision, what was kind of the decision-making process internally to even do the pilot? And can you tell us generally the overall cost for even doing those pilots so that people can get a sense of implementation?
That cost based on local rates is about $10,000 to $15,000 USD. The way that it actually started, what was your first question? It was
decision makers.
Decision makers. So that happened locally. I mean, it was one of these things where that's why I brought up the whole fact that there's a UN ops guy who just had Solidity background. There was a program manager who happened to have certain kind of program design background, and then a whole bunch of techie people who just all congealed. And they set up a Nepal Innovation Lab, which has a lot of different facets to it, but it was very much locally driven. So when I went out there with kind of a lot of our partnership leads to try to investigate what is going on, to realize that this is quite an interesting endeavor, it was coming from the grassroots. And I think that's where a lot of interesting things do happen.
Okay. Ashley, how about you?
Yeah, so we have a pilot, an public Ethereum network pilot that we're developing for the country of Colombia. It's a new digital public procurement system. So public procurement is the largest location of government corruption in terms of money in the world. In the state of Colombia, about 10% of public funds are lost in public corruption in general, procurement being the largest. In many other countries, it's even more. So we're developing a test, an experiment with whether an Ethereum-based solution with smart contracts, automated functionalities, this database censorship resistance that I told you about, and other new features that we build in could be superior to the existing system, and at increasing citizen access to the data, monitoring, integrity of records, and if we can point to this ultimately moving the needle at reducing corruption in procurement. So this is a pilot, it's an experiment, it's happening now, and we have a developer team in Colombia that we're working with, and the ROI, or the decision making.
Well, yeah, tell us a little bit about the budget for it, if you can, and then what it was like to kind of get decisions.
So again, these things are actually quite cheap. I'm not certain it's not final what the budget is, but I think I think as of now, all in, it's about $100,000 to create and integrate this, including the software development, which is a one-time cost. Maybe we'll add more features, so we could pay developers for that more later. And then the solution would, in theory, be scalable to many jurisdictions. And again, you don't have to pay network fees to Ethereum or anything like that. And then the decision making around this, the administration, the president, his name is Duque, is very interested in anti-corruption. So a lot of leaders campaign on anti-corruption, and Colombia is very, very progressive in terms of embracing technology innovation right now. And for the past couple of years, so they deliberately partnered with the World Economic Forum and wanted to sponsor and work with the Inter-American Development Bank, who's our other partner on this, for the creation of this project. So it's, they're very much embracing e-government and digital experimentation to try to improve processes, particularly towards reducing corruption. Yeah.
Great.
To give another example of like budget, so what we've decided is at the Human Rights Foundation, we want to focus on research and advocacy and make an impact in the corporate space through that way. So for example, we've started a privacy technology fellowship at the Human Rights Foundation that a particular technology company here in the Bay Area has sponsored. We're not talking a huge amount of money. We're talking, something like, $15,000 for, to bring somebody on for 4, 5, 6 months to write a series of essays that are like making a lot of basically creating a lot of debate on the internet. And then when the essays are done, they're going to be put into a report by an organization called Coin Center, which is like a 501c4 in Washington, and it's going to be distributed on Capitol Hill to like all the policymakers. So this is like a really, in our mind, a very effective way at making change and sparking a lot of education. So I would really look at like some of these also, like while you're maybe looking also at like technical solutions, I think research and advocacy stuff is really important, and it can be done for like, sort of small amount of money that you can really leverage. And just to underline, I think the impact that this field can have. How many people saw that image of the Venezuelan government blocking off the highways with trucks to prevent aid from coming in?
Yeah.
You all saw that, right? I mean, it's very vivid imagery of what I think is basically like history, basically, that governments, up to this day, but also, in history, used to be able to do that all the time. So the Burmese government also is infamous for this. After certain natural disasters, they would prevent aid from coming in. And they have like control over that, so they can do that. Not anymore, right? So while those trucks were blocking those highways, millions of dollars of Bitcoin were going in and out of Venezuela. So there's like nothing they can do anymore. And just to give you an idea of the scope of this technology, today, every day in Venezuela, more money gets traded on this one website, localbitcoins.com, which is like this eBay service for buying and selling Bitcoin, then Venezuelan bolivars are traded in the stock market in Caracas. So we're already to that point in this particular country. And just to give another number to help you wrap your mind around where we are with the scope of this, in 2018, Venmo did $62 billion of global payments. Okay, Venmo's a really popular micropayment app, obviously, that we use here in the United States. Visa did $8 trillion globally. Okay, so that's how much Visa does every year. Bitcoin last year, even in the most conservative estimate, did 600 billion. So it's almost at the same order of magnitude as Visa, way more than Venmo. And yet most people don't know much about it at all. So again, it's like a really great opportunity for educators, students, be that person at your team, company, working group to learn about it. And people are always like, well, should we invest in this, that, or the other? I say don't. Invest your time. Invest your time in learning about this stuff as opposed to your money.
Fantastic. I want to start opening it into questions to the audience to get you guys engaged. There's a mic right in the middle. Anybody have a burning question to start us? All right.
Yeah, you saw me on the main floor too, so I'm doing it. So I'm one of the folks who raised their hand, so know something about Bitcoin already. And one of the things is more like a comment, and it's broadly about how you guys as blockchain leaders can communicate to an audience that doesn't understand it. Everybody is going to conflate blockchain and cryptocurrency from the way you guys just presented it. And I totally agree that the power of cryptocurrency, of being able to get around authoritarian governments, really important. But if you want to come in and understand about blockchain, cryptocurrency is something you can do with blockchain. And what I was really excited to hear, Ashley, with what you're doing, and what I wanted to try to hear more about, because I think there's gigantic opportunity there as well, is the opportunity to be able to leverage blockchain, not just where there are authoritarian governments, but where there are governments with enormous corruption, where the goal, they're still democracies, there are leaders who want things to work, but on a practical level they don't. So procurement is a great example. The other classic blockchain idea is being able to have ledgers of who actually owns what land, so that there are public, immutable records, because that gets corrupted all the time. So I'd love to hear more about what you guys think are blockchain opportunities to be able to limit corruption and to be able to help in non-authoritarian spaces.
And I'll just mention, Colombia doesn't have enormous corruption. Generally, it's hard to measure these things, but it's kind of middle of the road. So just to make sure that's clear. Or like a Venezuela or some other countries higher.
So point taken. So we talked about at the beginning that the manifestation or implementation of blockchain comes in many flavors. Bitcoin and cryptocurrency was one of the original areas. But there's many more possibilities for using it, and it's already used. So land rights is certainly one of them. Healthcare is one of them. Any financial inclusion pieces, agriculture in general, supply chain. We talk a lot about.
Can I just make a quick comment on that? I think the biggest challenge for people when they're trying to put native digital assets work very well in a blockchain, like Ethereum, Bitcoin. When you try to put something from the real world like this on a blockchain, there's this thing called the oracle problem, which is predates the blockchain discussion in computer science, right? It's what if you have garbage data in, you're going to have garbage data out,
oracle?
Right? An oracle is like the point whereby the thing from the real world goes into the database. So if the person who inputs the data into the database screws up, we have a problem, right? So I watched Joe Lubin, who is like one of the big backers of the Ethereum project, have a conversation with Stephen Wolfram about this. So Wolfram Alpha, right? And this was a year and a half ago, and they were like, yeah, we don't have a solution to the oracle problem. Like, there is no solution to the oracle problem. So it's something you have to be really careful about, because if you're putting something like land registries or car titles or ownership over like priceless works of art onto a database, there could still be the problem of someone committing fraud when they put the thing into the database, right? So this is an area you just need to be really cautious about, in my opinion.
So there was an interesting example of someone logging onto Ethereum that they made the Mona Lisa, and really to point out, just because the data is on the blockchain doesn't mean it's accurate. It's the input.
Yeah. Some other examples, BankQ, if you're familiar with that, which is this special, is essentially an economic passport for those people who are unbanked. That's another implementation of this. Estonia, I think, as a government, all their e-services use blockchain as their back end. Modem.io, are you familiar with that? Yeah, so they essentially are registering all of medical supplies and seeing what the temperature is throughout the whole supply chain of medical, to make sure that,
Newsweek, sorry, I know this question. Newsweek in February or March came out with a list of social impact blockchain startups you can look up if you like to. It's the Newsweek Impact Awards. There's like 20, so it's with descriptions of each one. So interesting.
Great. Okay. Next question.
So 2 quick questions. I always find that blockchain as a technology is fascinating, but it always also seems to me a lot of times like it's a technology or a solution in search of a problem. And I had a little bit of that impression today as well when we talked about, for example, the new ways of transferring funds into another country. So whether it's the Sigma coin or that Facebook WhatsApp coin that might be a solution. I still don't fully grasp why that needs blockchain technology and not just a centralized transfer server. The other question kind of is the other side of it. The way you spoke about blockchain and cryptocurrencies is as a freedom mechanism that's robust against censorship. At the same time, that also means there is no positive control. So when you look at the current financial system, yes, it can be censored, but it can also be censored in a positive way. If you take evil dictator, drug dealer, terrorist, there are ways to freeze their funds or their assets, at least partially. They can still use cash and other mechanisms, but there are some ways of positive control. How do you think society can deal with that in an uncentralized, uncontrolled environment?
It's an awesome question.
I can take the first one. At least from an, wait, your first one was really, is it really valuable or not? And our SICA one, when we did the kind of quick and dirty metrics around it, I think our operating costs for a cash-based distribution program went down by 78%. World Food Program's Building Blocks, it's a rather famous project as well. That one went down, I think, by like 95% in terms of the actual operating costs for distributing cash locally. That is valuable. That's not necessarily from my perspective, the grandiose vision of transparency and trust that I think we would want. But there's, from an operational efficiency perspective, that is a benefit that a lot of other kind of cash-based distribution kind of traditional models don't have as much.
On the second point, I think what's important to remember is that virtually all corruption is committed by governments and banks, not by individuals. Virtually all. So, like, for example, last fall, Danske Bank, a very credible bank in a country of Denmark, which most people would say is very transparent, very democratic, whatever, they were caught laundering like $30 billion for the Russians, right? Okay, that's 1/3 of the entire cryptocurrency market cap, right? And that's just one bank getting caught once. We're talking a drop in the bucket. So when we really talk about where are the problems in the financial system, it's the financial system. It's not like, oh, there's like these little problems. No, the entire thing is entirely corrupt.
Yeah, but
so we're talking about rebuilding that whole thing.
But his point is still valid. So when you don't have the ability to reverse accidental transactions, or when you might want a centralized intervention, this is still valuable in the world in certain scenarios, and you can't do that with Bitcoin. So I would say maybe there's a hybrid type of a solution. For instance, what we're doing, we have smart contracts, but there's still a lot of rules around the system. And I mean, I think it's important to consider.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically at the end of the day, it's like you don't need a surveillance state, okay, to stop terrorists. There's a book called The Looming Tower, which is my favorite nonfiction book, and it tells the story of Osama bin Laden and John C. Reilly, who was an FBI agent who was tracking him his whole life. And the tragedy of the book is essentially that we had this guy, we knew where he was, and because these different agencies wouldn't talk to each other and basically screwed up their informations and their communication, we didn't get him, right? It wasn't because we didn't have a surveillance state. The whole Patriot Act thing is nonsense. The government doesn't need a surveillance state, does not need total Orwellian financial surveillance to stop bad guys. They do it with like legitimate investigative police work. So I just don't buy this thing that governments need to control all of the money.
I think they would say that like the ability to monitor financial transactions and to limit financial transactions is very important towards counterterrorism measures.
I don't agree. But yeah, we can have a debate.
We can have a debate, but I mean, I've sat on a lot of panels with a lot of global banks as well. I've had a lot of conferences with government policy officials from the church. Like, this is not going away. Even your grandiose dream of that this should not happen is not just going to disappear overnight.
Oh, I know.
mean, and so the AML-CFT kind of regime, it will exist. I mean, the amount of billions of dollars poured in by different global banks into KYC is real and will never go away. So the question really is, how does blockchain kind of fit into that reality? Because I would even say, I mean, if you look at the actual pilots that are happening on cross-border payments, a lot of them are not disintermediating the global banks. They're actually working in conjunction with them. There will be a front and end kind of linkage with various banks. That said, I mean, your comment about Venezuela and all these other, like, that would be an aspiration, that would be a dream, but there's got to be a little bit of a hybrid in the middle.
Again, it really depends where you live. Like in China today, you have total financial surveillance. You know, most people use WeChat, and you're stuck. Like, there's really nothing you can do. You can't even think about making a transaction without worrying about how that's going to affect you politically, right? Right? So if you make the wrong transaction, if you do something, the government's going to know, and your social score will basically go down, and you won't be able to access, you know, fast internet or send your kids to a private school. So like, these people are already totally screwed. They're like stuck. Bitcoin is a way out. Like, it's a way that they can now communicate without needing to create this big brother digital profile about them. So I think it's like, look, I work with people in the most horrific dictatorships around the world. So I should be like a very pessimistic, cynical person. But I have some optimism here. I'm actually pretty excited.
So, all right, with that, let's have the next question. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. My name is Sarbjeet Chugh. I run the blockchain business at Oracle. We have a blockchain as a service offering based off of Hyperledger Fabric. My question to you guys is, I also run the Blockchain for Good program at Oracle. We've done work around the bees project, the World Bees Project, trying to conserve the hives and the provenance of honeys so that everyone gets authentic honey and so on. And we've done some work in the Syrian refugee crisis. I would like to hear your thoughts on the, the self-sovereign identity aspect of blockchain, where you're trying to give funds or to give some sort of aid to these refugees, and so that they don't get twice, one person doesn't get twice the amount of aid. So there's no double spend there using a digital identity, because they don't have a passport anymore. They don't have, are you starting to see those kind of use cases around digital identity in the nonprofit space? And would love to work with you guys as part of Oracle. Would love to explore some opportunities.
Maybe you're better.
I mean, we have non-blockchain related digital identity programs that exist, our last mile mobile solution, but at the same time, that solution is embedding is further investigating digital identity opportunities. There are quite a lot of various NGOs. A lot of NGOs are looking into this as well, and we're kind of trying to get a sense of how that fits in with a lot of our structures. So I will hold off from answering exactly what we're doing right now.
The identity question is a great one. I think what's interesting is that when you have a decentralized system for money, like Bitcoin, for example, what it makes possible is that you don't need to have a bank account or a national identity or a passport. You don't need to prove your identity to anybody to receive money from me right now, right? So there's 2 billion people around the world who don't have either a bank account or a passport or an ID. So currently those people literally can't receive money from you. They can't. They have to go get it from someone at basically a government agency or a store. They have to go get it and basically get rations, because they don't have an ability to prove themselves, right? They might be in a refugee camp. They might be in an area that's destroyed or low infrastructure. That's totally changed now. Now all they need is access to basically a moderately smartphone and internet access. By the end of next year, 6.1 billion people will have a smartphone on this planet, okay? So they'll all be able to receive money from me. And again, this is quite revolutionary, and I think it turns the identity thing on its head, because it's not so much about providing identity to people. It's about making it so that we don't need to have identity. At least that's the way I'm looking at it from the civil liberties point of view.
So Bitcoin, what it specializes in is payments, but you can't store identity as a state on Bitcoin.
Well, that's what Microsoft's trying to do.
I would be interested
And
to know
Oracle
where they're
too.
storing the data.
So just to be real, and you can look this up. They have articles on this right now. In something like what they're trying to do, the data does not live on a blockchain. The data lives on something called IPFS, Interplanetary File System, which is a distributed, encrypted bunch of servers, okay? It doesn't live anywhere particular. It's just your private key, your ability to log in, that lives on the blockchain. That's it. The data doesn't live there, just to be clear.
And yeah.
Would love to talk to you guys offline.
Sure.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right.
We can, if we're using Ethereum, which is what IPFS is designed to work off of, or IPFS, these different things, then you could actually store passport information in these data record systems. And then, so if you're a refugee, then you can, if you're able to get to somewhere where people would believe and allow you to show your blockchain-based digital identity, then it can serve that purpose. And so the UN Development Program had a pilot in Moldova creating identities for women and girls in agricultural lands, because they get taken for trafficking often. So it's actually also an anti-trafficking solution. I don't know the status of these projects. There's not a lot of news about them, so it's yet to be determined how successful they are.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the challenges from my perspective, being able to scale certain pilots that we're seeing. I mean, there are a dime a dozen in terms of articles that are talking about all these pilots that are really successful on an individual localized level, but being able to scale it across different contexts, identity being one example.
Yeah, I think the research says that 65% of any blockchain technology, certainly in social impact, is still in the pilot prototype stage. So very few have kind of excelled to scale.
I mean, just to give you an idea of how you could make a difference right now, without needing to invent anything new, I was talking to a friend of mine. Her name's Weiwei Nu. She's a Rohingya Burmese refugee from the Muslim minority in that country. And she was in prison for 7-8 years. She just got a degree here at Berkeley. She's amazing. She was visiting a camp in Bangladesh where a lot of her people are, right? And they're in these camps. And I was asking her, like, do these people have passports or identification? Like, no, most of them don't have anything at all. Is there intermittent internet access in the camp? Yes, it's like there's basically towers, areas you can get access. So you could basically go, and the third question I asked her was, are there markets? Like, do people buy and sell things? Of course, every day people come in and sell food, clothing, whatever to the refugees, and there's like a little market. And if you've ever been to a refugee camp, you see this, right? So the question is, could you just go and start accepting Bitcoin for whatever people need, and then you could like start creating this little market, and then that way we all could just send value to these people in the camp, and we don't need them to have like bank accounts. Like this is, I think you're going to start seeing this happen like very soon. It's already happening in Venezuela. So this is like something you can just do right now. You can go out there and do it.
Yeah, it seems like there's some implementations that are a little bit more controversial, especially around finance, currency, et cetera. And then there's some that are essentially ubiquitously known as like easier access, like supply chain, right? It doesn't seem like the supply chain is something that has been contentious.
It has an Oracle problem, as like.
Not you.
This whole
Yes, it's your problem.
there's
So-
always problems with these
So-
cases.
That's a great lead into my
Yes,
question.
please. Okay.
Steve Terasaki, MBA 89. A couple of us here in the audience are working with another Haas colleague on this whole supply chain aspect of blockchain technology. And the value proposition is really to authenticate from the manufacturer to the direct customer, that ability for that product to actually be the product to be received on the other end. So high value products. So the current effort is in pharma. So cancer drugs, hep drugs that are really important for individuals' kind of survivability in countries like China, other places around the world where it isn't necessarily so easy to authenticate that actual drug that ends up with your doctor to be the drug that is actually the actual drug.
Yeah.
So a couple things that were said here that worry me a little bit is about this Oracle impact, this Oracle issue, and the current way in which that's done is through labeling, through providing a QR code where you can track that product through the supply chain. The question is, how scalable is a labeling strategy in the whole ability to ensure that the enormous numbers of drugs or other products that get sent, that ultimately get that received on the other end is scalable? First question. The second part is your statement that this blockchain technology is very democratized. So what are the barriers to entry for somebody else to come along and create this same blockchain? This blockchain, it's just a distributed ledger, right? And what are the barriers to entry for other people to become competitors with our Haas colleagues' great startup and this value added he's providing to the world? And as he and some of us who are involved in his success, what should we be thinking about? What are the issues that we should be helping him think through as regarding the success metrics of what we should be looking at? Thank you, and I'll sit down.
I could take the first.
You want to take the first? Okay, Ashley, go ahead.
I don't think, so the first question is, what's the scalability of the tagging of the goods that move through the, to my knowledge, I'm not a supply chain blockchain expert, but it's quite cheap and scalable. I mean, it can just cost a couple cents to tag something. We have QR codes tagged onto fruit today. You would want to make sure that the good is large enough value to merit the scale, like the tagging. As for high value goods, this becomes quite feasible, right? If you have an expensive good, you can easily tag it. But that's not a blockchain thing. And then I don't think it solves the Oracle problem. It doesn't solve the Oracle problem because the manufacturer needs to tag the good. So where the trust could break down is if the manufacturer improperly tags the good. So upon the provisioning of the identity or the tagging of the good, there's no, trust might not happen there.
On the second part of the question, I think it's about liquidity and network effect, right? Anyone can come in and fork or mutate or copy one of these blockchain projects. It's all open source code, right? So you can go in, people have taken Bitcoin and then they've made a version of it that's more private, for example, Zcash or something like that. And anyone can go do that. The question is who's going to use it, right? So the question is how do you create that network effect and how do you get millions and millions of people to use it, right? So that it can be valuable and secure. And that's the same question that Silicon Valley startups have faced for whatever, decades, right? So it's not that different in terms of how do you make what you're doing a success. It's very similar to well, how did the people who made Instagram and Twitter a success? They figured out a small group of really passionate users who then kept spreading it. So what you need is network effect, and that's hard to make.
Yeah, I mean, the general scope of that question is, competitive advantage, right? So you can have competitive advantage on your actual technology. You have competitive advantage from a business model design standpoint. I think what you're saying is essentially, this is very, the simple implementation of the technology is very easily adapted, and but it's how you use it and wrap the business model around it that's really important, right? Unless you build on top of the technology and therefore can patent some of the actual technology aspects that's changing and nobody else can actually do except for your organization. Okay, shall we take another question?
Hi, I'm Dave Crawford, and I'm not super familiar with blockchain, but I'm curious about what you think the top applications in healthcare are. Maybe it's personal health information in clinical trials. Healthcare is often late to adopt new technologies and trying to, outside of the financial world, what do you think is going to happen or is happening?
Yeah, we don't.
I could
touch
speak to it,
healthcare.
but
I mean, just generally speaking, I think there's a family of technologies that are related to this idea of privacy and of helping us keep our data to ourselves. So one of those, which is actually being innovated certainly here at Berkeley by one particular company, Oasis, right? So Don Song is working on this, and there's a bunch of other academics. Shafi Goldwasser at MIT is also working on this. Zero-knowledge cryptography, right? Which of course can be mixed with blockchain, but it's its own thing. Basically this idea that I can have something, I can prove to you that I have it without showing it to you. So this idea that I could have my medical records, I could have them sovereign to me on a local device, and I could disclose whatever I would like about that to doctors, hospitals, et cetera. This is potentially somewhere where we could go, which would be very different than the existing system, which is most Americans, including me, have no freaking clue where all of our healthcare records are. Right. So it could be interesting. I'm, as a privacy advocate, really interested in how can we own our digital records? How can we own our health records? I don't necessarily see a way that any current blockchain projects would revolutionize that at the moment. But again, big companies are working on it, and I think it's interesting to follow. Yeah,
and then pharmaceutical supply chain is one of the major uses of blockchain. I mean, it's really it can be very helpful for many reasons. I don't know if we have time to. Okay, so there's a regulation that's going into effect in 2022 called the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, where U.S. companies must show the provenance history of drugs through the supply chain. This helps counter opioid trafficking and things like this. And there's no good database system for the tracking of the movement of these drugs because there are dozens of parties in the drug supply chain. So there's a consortium and there's efforts called the MediLedger Project and others, where you have major pharmaceutical companies and blockchain startups such as Chronicled helping to solve this problem and creating blockchain-based solutions for the tracking of the drugs. You do tag the drugs in interesting tamper-proof ways. You can have a seal around the cap of the drug that shows that if it's been opened for counterfeiting, to take the drugs out to sell them on the black market and put in fake drugs, it could send an alert to a blockchain system, or it would show tampering. And then also on the sensor, this isn't dependent on blockchain, but you could have temperature control, temperature information gathering to see if the drug has crossed certain thresholds that would make it less viable and effective. For vaccines and drugs, if it reaches warm temperatures through the supply chain, it would be less effective. So this is very important, and the value add of blockchain through all of this is this shared, again, people, paper, and processes database where you have multiple suppliers who don't trust each other, and no one wants to defer to Pfizer or Merck to own the complete database. themselves because they could be manipulating it or having problems with it. So that's the other really interesting.
Yeah, you can see, I don't know the specific organization doing this, but in R&D where you actually need to have patient data, but you can't actually access patient data.
Right.
You have to have thousands and thousands of actual examples. You can see that there's a potential opportunity there
Right.
to utilize that as backend. Yep.
Yeah, clinical trials, I see
Yeah.
a big opportunity, but I'm just not aware of how it's being used.
I haven't seen that many or anything. Really.
I mean, the zero knowledge cryptography thing's huge, because imagine if we could all like sell our and decide to sell our medical data in a way that doesn't disclose us, but would really help science, right?
Yeah,
If
yeah.
all of a sudden all of our like medical profiles could be like researched and sorted and all this stuff without linking it to us, right?
Right.
So that's like
Right.
the key innovation, and we're maybe 2 to 3 years away from that.
But we
in
could
some
just
aspects.
submit anonymized health records, right? It doesn't have to have a layer of cryptography that obfuscates the record, right?
I'm going to let the last person, thank you very much
Yeah,
for your
thank you.
question. And then the last question before lunch, because I know everybody's getting hungry. Go for
All
it.
right.
Really quick.
My name is Frank Rockwood, class of 1993. I think this is going to be a short question. So I'm very intrigued about the Microsoft project, and clearly that kind of makes them look good relative to Google and Facebook. But I just wanted to ask you to speculate on other aspects of their business case that they might be thinking of why they're doing that.
Yeah, so I'll give you a link. Yeah, okay. So
leading question.
So like my knowledge about it is from a podcast that I can go give you the link to it. So the head of the project gave an interview, a long interview about what they're doing. So all of my knowledge about it is from that, right? But I think if you were to say 20 years ago that Microsoft was going to build freedom technology and Google was going to build the surveillance state, you would have probably gotten laughed out of the room. But I think that's arguably true. I mean, Microsoft's like investing huge into open source like code. They bought GitHub. Like, I think there's some interesting stuff going on. They're certainly not like innocent by any means. I mean, clearly they've been linked to some worrying stuff in China and some other things. But I think we need to, at least from the human rights point of view, when a company does something right, we really need to celebrate that. That's really important because it incentivizes companies to do more things that are right, okay? In the same way that when a company does something bad, we're going to condemn them, right? So we need to be really interactive on this. And when we talk about adoption of this kind of frontier technology, we can think about encryption, right? Which of course was very scary to regulators and governments. But eventually, after the Snowden revelations, right, we had a situation where WhatsApp, not by choice, but by force essentially, decided to adopt, peer-to-peer encryption, right? So they didn't decide one day, wake up and say, oh, we're gonna do this. No, they were like, oh my God, this would be good for us based on what our clients want, right? So I think this can make a big difference. I think we all need to just raise our voice and celebrate companies when they do good things and condemn them when they do bad.
You're here on that note. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna thank the panelists, Ashley, Steve, and Alex. Thank you very much.